Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar that examines how LPG can help to reach the clean cooking objective of SDG7. LPG has not received much notice in our own SDG7 work. We hope this seminar will be the beginning of a new trend. We have more than 50 people who have said they will attend. So, welcome to everybody. My name is Petter Nore. I'm a senior consultant of Norad and will guide you through this webinar. The webinar is being streamed on YouTube at the moment. And one more technicality, when we come to the Q&A from the audience at the end of the session, please use the raise your hand button. I will deal with these as they come in. If you feel like you must use the chat, this will be monitored by my colleague Mina Weidal. So just use the chat in the normal way. We have a tight agenda, so without much further ado, let me introduce Mr. Stig Tråvik, Director of Climate, Energy and Environmental Division of Norad, who will give some introductory remarks. He has formerly been working for Ministry of Climate and Environment and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Stig, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Petter, and thank you to all of you for joining us here today, in particular to our panelists. So welcome and happy New Year. I guess we were all eager to put 2020 behind us, but I think the burden is still on 2021 to prove itself to really be a better year. Hopefully we will put the COVID-19 pandemic behind us, but there is still a grave danger that economically the burden, especially on poor people, is yet to be seen. That also goes for energy and SDG7 and the topic of today. As many as 30 million people in Africa who had access to electricity in 2019 might actually no longer be able to afford it this year. That, of course, also applies to clean cooking. Millions of households are at risk of losing access to modern fuels, returning to charcoal, kerosene, or fuel wood. So energy access is, of course, important for electricity to turn on the light, to turn on a TV, to power a hospital, for energy to prepare a meal, or to be on a Zoom conference. Cooking energy is a separate subtopic of our global energy challenge. I would argue that we need to redouble our efforts towards 2030, considering the number of people who lack access and the severity of the consequences. Energy for cooking is a basic need. It links to other development goals. How daily meals are prepared affect a family's health and well-being, children's ability to take advantage of education, freeing up hours to take paid work, study, or simply rest. The natural environment a family lives in and overall land use is also affected by how people cook. Charcoal production can cause deforestation, risk of soil erosion, and other environmental damage that harms community livelihoods and the planet. You've all heard the phrase, almost 3 billion people lack access to clean cooking, many, many times before. And if you feel that this phrase is getting a bit old, it is because it is. We haven't made much progress the last 10 years. So since 2010, progress has been marginal. 3 billion lacked access in 2010 against 2.8 billion in 2019. In Africa, the percentage of people who do not have access to clean cooking solutions is actually growing. In order to reach the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Goals, we need to drastically reduce the use of fossil fuels. Basically, we need to stop burning stuff. But first of all, we need to stop burning forests. Replacing charcoal with gas would still not be without dilemmas. So this webinar is for all of us to contribute, to listen, to reflect around the challenges of clean cooking, and specifically the role of liquefied petroleum gas. Norad wants to promote solutions that can accelerate progress on universal access to clean, modern energy. I'm excited to hear from this panel that represents both civil society, private, and the public sector. Thank you for attention, and over to you, Petter.
Thank you, Steve. Last year, Norad asked the Multiconsult to write.
Petter, you are muted.
I'm sorry, I'll have to start again. Last year, Norad asked Multiconsult to write a report on the status of LPG and its links to SDG7. Highlights of the report will be presented by Ms. Mari Furu, Senior Advisor and Energy Economist at Multiconsult, where she has been involved in multiple assignments in the field of access to energy and renewable development, mainly in African countries. Mari, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me and that you can see this slide that I'm sharing. As Petter said, my name is Mari Sofie Furu. I'm a consultant for Multiconsult and worked with this report for Norad last year. So in 5 short minutes, I would like to present to you some key takeaways from this report that we should all bear in mind when we're talking about LPG as an alternative solution in developing countries. So first, the general context. It has been mentioned already, but it is important. The use of traditional forms of cooking with biomass leads to tremendous losses in terms of premature deaths, health problems, economic losses, and environmental and climate degradation. Second, with the current level of effort dedicated to access to clean cooking, we will fail to ensure universal access, and we will fail to achieve the SDGs. Third, LPG is an important, while not the only, but an important way to ensure clean cooking for people who currently lack access. Fourth, the positive impacts from a transition from traditional cooking to use of LPG could bring significant positive impacts on several layers of society. Fifth, there are significant barriers to such transition, and it is necessary to get an enabling framework in place to enable the sector to develop and reach an ever-growing number of people. These 5 very short statements I will try to justify with some key facts following. First, this was already mentioned. I can go very quickly through this. There's still 2.8 billion people lacking access to clean cooking fuels and technologies. And this is much more than the people who are lacking access to electricity. This causes indoor air pollution and causes up to 3 million annual deaths or premature deaths, again resulting in large economic losses. And it also, the use of biomass also causes unsustainable wood harvesting and degradation of forests and climate change. In fact, the majority of the black carbon emissions in Africa come from biomass cooking. Second, we will not reach the goals. Last year in our report, we found that at least 30% of the world's population will remain without access in 2030, far away from the SDG goal. And as was mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic may have made this target even further afield for us. On the other hand, clean cooking is a stepchild. The amounts used are dwarfed by the amounts spent to increase, for example, access to electricity. To LPG. LPG is a viable alternative for a large amount of people who currently lack access to clean cooking solutions. It is clean, it has negligible harmful emissions, and it does not harm the user's health. In the figure that you see, the International Energy Agency considers LPG as one of the main solutions for a sustainable future. They foresee that a large-scale transition to use of, among other solutions, LPG must take place to achieve the SDGs. The right-hand pie shows the scenario where the SDGs are achieved in Africa, and the projections that LPG will take up more than a third of the cooking market in Africa by 2030 to achieve these goals. If such an increased uptake and a transition to LPG will be achieved, it would represent significant positive impacts at multiple layers of society. On the society level, it would contribute to several of the SDGs, including improving global health, reducing climate gas emissions, and reducing the degradation of natural resources. On the household and individual level, as LPG is a convenient and time-saving, safe energy source that is not harmful to health. And it's worth noting that all these effects will particularly benefit women. LPG also has a great potential for job creation. It has a long value chain with that allows for many smaller actors, also on the local level.
5 minutes.
So there are significant barriers to this transition, although it seems positive. There is a need to increase the awareness of alternatives and their benefits, ensure that the clean alternatives are affordable to obtain and use, available in local settings. Favorable regulations must make LPG attractive, and not least, financial support to expand markets and businesses are required. And all this will not happen unless there is sufficient policy attention, knowledge available, support, and large investment in infrastructure. So the question remains then, some countries have already increased LPG in their national plans, and is the international community up for the challenge to pick up the ball and get running with this challenge? Thank you.
Thank you. Given that you had 5 minutes to summarize 200 pages, I think you did extremely well. Thank you very much. Next part of the proceedings will, let me see. Can you hear me? Yeah. Next part of the proceedings will have 2 parts. First, a short 3 minutes introduction by our panelists, followed by a conversation which I will moderate. Again, I will gently remind people about the 3-minute time limit. The first speaker will be Jean-Louis Racine, Chief Program Officer at the Clean Cooking Alliance. Formerly, he has led the World Bank's Climate Technology Program. Jean-Louis, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me on this panel. And I'm here to represent the Clean Cooking Alliance. And one of the ways that the Clean Cooking Alliance supports LPG and clean cooking is through a program we call the Cooking Industry Catalyst. So it's a program that aims to create scalable markets that bring clean cooking to the 3 billion people who aren't benefiting from it. It's a market building approach that aims to achieve commercially viable solution. And we're taking this approach because given the evidence, given the history of the sector and the targets, it's not likely that by relying on public sector funding alone, we'll be able to reach that goal in 2030. So the Clean Cooking Catalyst, Cooking Industry Catalyst, supports this market building in 2 ways. One is through direct technical or financial support to promising enterprises with scalable and sort of innovative business models. And another way is by trying to plug the gaps in the enabling ecosystems that helps those firms succeed. So help the factors that help the firms succeed in addition to helping the firms directly. So those gaps can be related to policy, to regulation, to government infrastructure, for example, standards and testing, through investment markets, carbon markets, consumer demand, and knowledge related to markets, technologies, consumer behaviors, and business models. All of those things are a bit, sum up the reason why there are lots of factors and we need a holistic approach to have this market take off. And we see LPG as having a key role in making clean cooking sustainable to all, because it's considered a clean fuel by the WHO in terms of clean cooking. And to see the sort of health protective benefits from clean cooking, you need a full transition to clean fuels. So traditional dirty fuels meet a lot of challenges when we try to improve them, and going to LPG, biogas, ethanol, electric, etc., has huge sort of dramatic health improvements over traditional fuels. We also need a mix of technology. So it's like, the clean electricity generation sort of transition. Clean cooking also needs an energy mix that depends on local markets, context, etc. And LPG can be part of that equation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. My next speaker should be Hannah Marva. She's head of the investment and business development of Circle Gas. Hannah, are you anywhere in the audience of the 50 plus people? So please shout out, because if not, something must have gone wrong. I understand you are somewhere in the Middle East, so there might be some logistic reasons for this. Anyway, shout out, and Mina will take care of you. But in the meantime, I move to Sheila Addo, who is the director of Ghana National Petroleum Authority. Sheila, the floor is yours. Give us a 3-minute quick update on the situation in Ghana.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. So in Ghana, we set up this ambitious policy to promote LPG use. It's the timeline for starting this policy was 2013, 2015, but we actually started implementation in 2017. Prior to the policy, we had multiple marketers that were distributing LPG in somewhat an unsafe manner. So we had some safety mishaps, some incidents and all of that. And so we decided to change the distribution model to a cylinder recirculation model, with a goal of making sure that there's 50% access to LPG by the year 2030. That required us to change everything, change the guidelines, or sort of update the guidelines a little bit, also update the market structure a little bit. The states that we're in is that this is the second time cylinder recirculation is being implemented in Ghana, but the first time it wasn't done successfully because there wasn't consistency with the supply of LPG. That was in the late 80s. And so we tried to tackle those issues, the infrastructure challenges with storage, the accessibility challenges with imports of LPG. Fortunately, once we struck our local oil, we were able to also produce LPG from the natural gas. So that part's been resolved. Then we also fixed the pricing issues by going price deregulation to make sure that investors are convinced to invest in our market, because once they invest, there's no question of subsidy, and so products are paid, or their investments are paid for. We've started a pilot implementation of the CRM. We've done quite a number of training for the marketers. We've improved upon the licensing category. We've made sure that marketers are supposed to invest in the cylinders and also build a customer base based on a brand. Marketers are responsible for the cylinders because a big concern for consumers are the safety of cylinders, and especially for a country like ours where there are alternative cooking fuels, people are worried about the safety of the use of LPG, and so they would easily move on. In order to boost confidence of consumers with the safety of LPG, we're trying to make sure marketers are responsible for that, and we're improving upon a nationwide consumer education and sensitization about the safe use of LPG as a clean cooking fuel to be used. I think I'll just pause here because I might go on and on, but when I have another turn to speak, I'll give you a bit more insight into what we're doing as well.
Sheila, thank you very much. We will come back to you. The next speaker is Dag Arne Høistad. He's head of the International Division, Friends of the Earth of Norway. He has more than 10 years experience from clean cooking activities in Central Asia and Africa. Dag, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We are very pleased that clean cooking is that you take this initiative to lift clean cooking on the agenda. I guess most people will be curious to know how we as an environmental organization view initiatives to increase use of fossil gas. I will come back to that with some reasoning. If you look at the climate policy, of course, all of you know the needs to try to reach the 1.5 degree target. And we know that the carbon budget that we globally have available is limited. But we think that when you implement the climate policy, climate justice is also a very important aspect, that we have to share the burden, and those who have historical responsibility and economical strength to make transition have to take the biggest share. So when it's come to increase in fossil gas for cooking purposes in the south, this is something we absolutely can support and will support, and see it's very timely to promote and support. We have some comments to how that could be done when it's come to supporting that. We think it's important not to go back to subsidy of fuels and fossil fuels in particular, but to have support and enabling environment for households to get the equipment needed to start to use LPG. We think it's very limited and high time to do. We also think that it's important to think a little bit longer, that supporting schemes are open for different technologies. As it's been mentioned before, there's no solution for everyone. And it's also important to think that maybe in the future it's possible to phase in the use of biogas using the same type of equipment when there are production capacity for biogas in the future. So there's also another reason not to subsidy the fuel, but the equipment necessary to use. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jean-Louis, will you be the stand-in instead of Hannah Marva, because she has still not turned up, has she? It doesn't seem like it. Jean-Louis, can you hear me now? No, he cannot. Okay. Anyway, then we will start on our discussion. My colleagues will try to locate Jean-Louis to pull him into the discussion. But in the meantime, we have Mari, we have Dag, and we have Sheila as a very valuable panel, as is. My first question to you is, if each of you would have to identify 2 factors that you thought would be crucial to increase the market share of LPG in cooking in Africa, what 2 factors would you actually concentrate on? I don't want a big statements, but just short so that you can give the audience some kind of an idea about how you think. Mari, what do you think?
Thank you. I mentioned, if that was taken up in the very short time, that there are many factors and many elements that need to be in place for this transition to happen. So it's easy to come up with 2, but it's important also to note that 2 only won't do the trick. But if I can just highlight two elements that I think are very important. One is access to finance, and that sort of addresses two parts of this picture: access to finance for market actors and investors to build out the distribution chains to reach also into more rural areas, and also access to consumer finance, because some people cannot afford at the current prices and must be helped to get started and to get into the market. So that's one. The second is to get clean cooking targets into national overall plans. I know many countries already have that. I believe that targets related to clean cooking also need to be made more concrete and measurable. I believe one of the reasons this issue has been so, if not ignored, but has lacked showing progress, is because it's not attractive enough on the policy level. It doesn't entail the big major infrastructure projects to be proud about. It is also a problem that maybe largely is seen as a problem affecting women and poor people. So to make it more sort of policy level attractive, I think also is an important.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Maybe a little quicker than Mari.
Yeah, I agree that it's more than two, but to take pick two and seen from a consumer perspective, it's obvious the upfront investment cost for the equipment. It comes for the start package and when you are going to refill the bottle. So if you find a way to smooth out a daily payment, then you have solved most of the challenge, as it is profitable compared to charcoal, for instance, already. It's just a problem that you can't pay day by day.
Very concrete and to the point. We'll follow up on that one. Sheila, what are your 2 points?
Well, Peter, from our experience from the policy perspective, I think you need, number one, a very good policy commitment. It drives everything. So policy commitment in terms of the decision of the government of the day on how you want to achieve LPG uptake. Okay, it will drive the signals you're sending to investors for them to invest in the resources you need. It will drive the decision that helps shape the commercial arrangements that help bring LPG in, as well as the price. So if there's a policy commitment to getting it done, there will be some policy statements about the kind of infrastructure that's needed, the kind of distribution network that is needed. There will be some good policy statements also about the price. My second take here would also be the consumers. There has to be some broad consumer education and even stakeholder consultation. From our experience, we've had to do a wide nationwide education for LPG consumers, or even for non-LPG consumers as well. Just so you break down some of the myths about LPG use. It's very crucial for that, to get consumer buy-in by educating them.
Thank you. That we have, sorry. Yes, you can hear me. We know, luckily, have Hanan Marwa with us. Welcome. A little bit late, but that doesn't matter. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. You have a very interesting position. You are head of investment and business development of Circle Gas, and you have worked in the financial sector for the last 18 years. So here we are now starting to zoom in on the commercial side, the business model, which normally you don't talk too much about when you are dealing with development. But I think this is a perfect position, and perfect LPG is a perfect point of entry for making some reflections about that. Hannah, can you say something very quickly about Circle Gas? And then we can use that as a basis for a wider discussion on what are the pros and cons of this particular model. So you have a couple of minutes to just very briefly introduce it and say why it's important.
Thank you very much, Peter. So the Circle Gas business model builds on the fundamental shift in pricing across many countries where lack of clean cooking is a problem, and where the LPG industry, or LPG, is now cheaper than the competing dirty fuels when bought in somewhat bulk, and where LPG is already increasing in many of those countries, LPG use, and then also builds on the work that many existing players in the clean cooking sector have done on developing pay-as-you-go models. So Circle Gas joined forces with the Copa-Gas technology, which has a smart meter, which has a pay-as-you-go facility. And in order to launch LPG pay-as-you-go services really at scale across a number of initially sub-Saharan African countries. The fundamentals of the business model are, number one, LPG is cheaper than the competing fuels. Even when you add in the cost for us of adding in the pay-as-you-go facility. But then every day a customer saves money by cooking with gas relative to charcoal and kerosene. So we can't compete with firewood, which is free, but for the other fuels, LPG is actually cheaper. I should say this is an urban business model. It's not for rural areas. And also it's not for every country. If LPG, for various reasons, is not cheaper, then our model does not work. But many sub-Saharan African countries now, LPG is cheaper. We are trying to make LPG more accessible by providing the upfront equipment needed to access LPG. We provide this free of charge to customers, which is a cylinder, a stove, and a smart meter, which is owned by Circle Gas. And we install that in customers' homes. A customer only pays for the LPG that they use as they use it. I should say the other aspect of our business model is that we launch in areas where we have very high customer concentration. We only will launch in an area where we think we can get at least 10,000 roughly households within a few kilometers area. And we set up a local depot in that area and we service the customers from there. This is important because it's the equipment that we own, which is going into customers' homes. It needs to be looked after. It needs to be repossessed if it's being misused or if it's not being used. So, and it's important for us that we're very close to all of our customers and we can service them very well. And also that we have a direct relationship with customers for safety and other reasons. So I suppose those are the main aspects of the business model. Number one, fundamental LPG is cheaper. Number two, we're taking away the upfront barrier for many households in accessing LPG, which is lack of upfront capital to invest in the stove, the cylinder, and the refill. And number three, high levels of customer concentration so that we can look after our equipment and make sure we get it back. And when those three things come together, it's a very sustainable business model. We currently have about, sorry.
No, that's fine. This is very interesting and very good news for everybody. I mean, you are talking about a source of energy that is actually cheaper than charcoal, for instance, which means that the market for cooking must fundamentally be changing in your favor, which is very, very interesting for everybody. Sheila, you have already mentioned the importance of the commercial sector in dealing and building an LPG business in Africa. How do you react to Hannah's statements? Is there anything that Ghana can learn from this?
Absolutely, Peter. Ghana is already thinking along the lines of what Circle Gas is doing. There's actually a company in Ghana called EnviroFit. EnviroFit did a pilot implementation of what Circle Gas is doing in the likes of Tanzania. In this case, they provided a cylinder with a smart meter on it and tested it in homes. I absolutely agree. This is a fantastic model, especially for low-income consumers. And if you're looking to target consumers in developing countries, you have quite a number of them. One phenomenon we also observed in Ghana is that apart from these low-income consumers, you've got people who purchase LPG just for the day. These are small, medium-scale enterprise people, those who sort of cook street food, if you like. So they cook just for the day. They have a budget for the day. So they're purchasing LPG for the day to just sell what they need to sell for the day. And so this model is very fantastic. There's a local marketing company that is looking to pilot it with their commercial customers, those who cook for the day and put a smart meter on it. I don't agree with Hanan when you say that LPG is more expensive than firewood. Even though wood fuel is picked just from the backyard of a lot of homes, the environmental impact, the health impact, and all of that makes it more costlier than LPG is. And so for us, we look at the overall impact and the overall cost, not just the fuel. There are a lot of strengths with this model. Pay as you cook. Other people call it the pay as you go, pay as you cook model. One of the strengths, I believe, is that it helps address the challenge of uptake, especially for low-income consumers, as I said. The circle gas model, which provides cook stoves and accessories upfront, even makes it the better, because there's an upfront cost for the consumer to go purchase a cook stove and a regulator and hose before they get to the LPG cylinder. So that's even way better for them. There's also low maintenance in terms of the daily payment for LPG, because you're paying as you cook. If you're buying about a CD or $1 worth, that's what you need. Then there's safety, because the responsibility of safety of the equipment goes to the vendor. And so the consumer doesn't have to worry about the safety of the LPG cylinder or the bottle that's in their home, because it's solely the responsibility of the vendor. But there are some challenges I'm hoping technology will help address. In most countries, especially the developing countries, you're likely to also have network issues. I understand that the technology that the smart meter works with is you have to, for the one I've seen, you have to use your mobile phone to send a request to the vendor to allow you to, or use your mobile phone to pay for what you want to use. And you know what you're supposed to get is allowed you through a network connection. And so if you don't have a good internet or a good telephone or mobile phone network connection, there's a problem. And so we need to look at that to improve upon the technology. I think also interferences and tampering with a device might be a problem that the vendor would want to look at. But I'm hopeful improvement in technology will help deal with this, but it's overall a good solution.
This is the best PR you can get, Hanan. This sounds incredible. Dag, you mentioned specifically the sort of one of the barriers being the lack of finance to actually finance a cylinder up front. And here Hanan comes with a business idea that they are basically carrying that cost. This must also be very much in something that you think is a good development, yes?
Absolutely. Our experience with the charcoal value chain is that it's so inefficient. There's only a small fraction of the energy in the original wood that end up as useful for cooking. So that's make it extremely expensive. So alternatives, almost all alternatives are cheaper. It's just the problem with financing the equipment that you need.
Brilliant. Hanna, what are the main weaknesses of your model?
I think the last two speakers mentioned some of the really the significant ones, which are that it's a good idea. The challenge is to really scale it and operationalize it in a way which is commercially sustainable and can really build a long-term business which delivers necessary returns for the investors. So there are many different parts of the business which are not really very glamorous from a clean cooking point of view, but if you don't do them, then it won't be sustainable. So, for example, smart meters, these are not readily available on the market. We produce our own smart meters. We have our own technology, our own patents for smart meters. And we have to deal with our own manufacturing of these in China, for example, and then bring them to our markets. And it's not very interesting, but we need to get it right. We need to be able to really do it to scale. We produce more than 40,000 already. And we have a very ambitious rollout schedule for this coming year. But if we don't do that, then there's no business. Also, the density that I mentioned before is a really important internal operational discipline to the business. And the other, I would say, the next thing is working with the customer. And I think Sheila mentioned the importance of customer communication and education. There is really a technology adoption which is happening. And the best business model for doing this and the best way of communicating it to our customers with our business model, it's still being refined. So there's a lot for us to learn just from working with tens and tens of thousands of customers and getting it better and better. I would say those are the main things.
Mari, can we continue with what has now been put on the table, namely that Hannah and also I think Sheila, even though you went exactly direct on this, this is an urban phenomenon so far that I understand, the business model that we have just discussed. Is there any chance, you think, of LPG penetrating the rural and give energy to the rural poor? Or do you think that you have to have two thoughts in your head at the same time and do improvement in traditional cook stoves at the same time as you do LPG? What are your reflections on this, Marit?
Thank you. I think you do need to have at least two thoughts in the head at the same time. Rural is, of course, a lot of different things. It's everything between the most remote areas up to the peri-urban areas. And I don't think that LPG is not a solution for relatively rural areas. But judging in some countries, there is a very fast development now of LPG in cities. This is happening, for example, in Tanzania. And it grows organically and very fast and becomes the preferred option gradually. But the scale and expansion that is required to reach gradually more rural areas, it will not happen by itself. So for it to become more relevant in rural areas and for the sector to develop and expand, it is necessary with support, investment into the value chain, and this needs sort of external support, not just relying on the market actors to build this out. This has been mentioned several times. It will be also important, as Sheila mentioned, to stimulate demand, in particular in those areas where LPG may be a less known and acknowledged solution. But as Sheila also mentioned, considering the global cost of using biomass at the scale it is currently used, just more than justifies the investment that is necessary. So that's one point. I would also like to mention that there are some countries who already have achieved a very big spread of use of LPG into rural areas, such as Morocco, India, Brazil, where LPG is really used by the big majority of the population. And that just shows that it's not restricted to only urban areas. I think getting LPG into rural areas will also be very dependent on the business model. It was mentioned here that circle gas, for example, requires a high density to make their model work. So business model development is also necessary to have a model that can work in the environment it should operate. So I think it's possible, but it will require support for business development, market regulation, infrastructure investments, and promotion of demand an improvement of affordability, all these things that have been mentioned.
Okay. Can you, because I want to move to one final thing before we go to the Q&A session. So can you finalize your comment?
Yes, the last point was you asked, do we need to think about several solutions? And I think yes. Some areas it will take too long time for the modern clean solutions to reach the most remote areas. So I believe that it is also necessary to consider highly efficient biomass stoves as a solution for some areas. Into the first years.
Okay, thank you. Doug, can I ask you a question? NGOs have normally been, as you were saying, quite skeptical to anything to do with fossil fuels, and LPG is a fossil fuel. I understood you rightly that you look at the wider picture and say that there are so many advantages of LPG from a health point of view, everything else, that it outweighs that it might increase climate emissions. Can you just do a little bit of thinking around that before, as a final thing, before we go to the Q&A session? Because as you know very well, there are important forces around who don't want us to even participate in LPG activities. And then even the Nordic Development Bank has in its, it says that it doesn't lend to LPG projects. So can you say just briefly something around this? Thanks.
Yeah, now we have to discuss this in a group of NGOs in Norway that consist of solidarity organization, development organization, environmental organization, and we have quite similar thoughts around climate justice. So it's more a justice point of view that it's we in the region north that have caused the main problem, have historically the big emission and have the capacity to reduce. So in order to keep the global carbon budget that we have to stay within, it's our task in the north to reduce a little bit more in order to create a room for not so big this reduction or even an increase in carbon emissions from developing countries. And I think it's a difference between cooking sector and electricity sector. If you ask about using fossil or state support for fossil fuel power production in the south, we would oppose that and say it's better to use the money for alternative renewable power production. But when it's come to cooking, it's a different story because all the reasons as you mentioned, and that in fact it will probably decrease the emission because the alternative use of biomass has even higher emission than use of fossil fuels here.
Thank you. This must be interesting political input as well, to have such a clear message to the political people who create our policies. So I'm sure people will be listening with great interest to what you have been saying. So we seem to have a fairly sort of unanimous group of people who actually are very enthusiastic for this LPG solution, and that it obviously needs to look in more detail at this. There are no people who have raised their hands. There is, sorry, was there in the chat a question to Hannah? You meant, sorry, can you read it?
So the first one is from Daniel Pope, who says that if you factor in the reductions of emission from biomass and deforestation, scaling LPG can be climate neutral with a health gain.
Yeah, sorry. I can just maybe do a brief comment about that. I just wanted to share a paper that we'd published looking at the health gain from scaling adoption of LPG in Cameroon along their aspirational target of adoption under the Sustainable Development Goal 7. And we also modelled the impacts on climate from increased CO2 from achieving that scale, accounting for a conservative estimate of deforestation and emissions from black carbon and methane. And in fact, achieving that substantial scale has substantial health gain that can be measured, and it's not at the expense of climate, which is a really important piece of information we sort of fed back as a policy brief. So I just put a link to that paper in the chat function.
Thank you very much. Any comments from the panelists on this particular issue? If not, are there any more issues that have been raised, Mina?
There is.
Go on.
So there's one from Thomas Fogrup who says thank you to the speakers, and he has a question to Hanan. You mentioned the need that you need a certain density for your business model. Are you also looking at the ability to pay, and if so, can you share the relevant numbers?
Thank you for the question. Our customers are our target customers are already cooking with charcoal and kerosene. And we launch in countries where cooking with those every day is more expensive than our substitute, which is LPG. So we don't credit check customers. If customer is currently using kerosene or charcoal, then they can afford our product. We have looked at other criteria like family sizes and things like that. Our first reaction is really, once we really build up a huge number of customers, it's much easier to then segregate them and say who's a good customer, who's a bad customer. But so far, we haven't found things like family size. So long as you have 2 or 3 people in the household, we haven't found it to be have a huge impact on consumption, actually. So long as someone's cooking with charcoal or kerosene, they're a good customer for us in the countries where we are. Thanks.
I see that there are actually quite a few comments in the chat, and I see that 2 people have raised their hand. Should we maybe, I see James Hazlip has a quite long comment. I wonder if I should invite him to ask that question instead, and then maybe afterwards we could have Renzo B and Kimball Shen, and then Rafaela Belanca ask their questions and go back to the chat.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. So go ahead.
Hi, Mina. Yeah, nice to see you there. Yeah, sorry, it wasn't so much a question, more kind of contribution to the debate.
I would prefer a question because
okay,
that's
then
much...
I'll leave it there then. Thanks.
Fine. Question. It's sorry about this style, but it's the best. It's in the interest of everybody to sort of get a dialogue going. Renzo, do you have anything that you want to ask?
Yes, hello to everyone. Very interesting. We are the Global LPG Partnership. We have a lot of experience on the development of the LPG in many countries. Myself, I know more than 40 markets. There are 2 things I don't hear, and I would like to know if it's relevant for them, for those who are involved, is how to finance a low-cost access to cylinders for the marketers. So the marketer is the key guy. If he doesn't invest in enough number of cylinders, there's nothing that will happen. So, and this is critical. The second question is, don't you think, because I'm very familiar with Africa, I've worked in Nigeria, etc., and price abuse is an issue. So, and when the prices are uncertain, in lack of visibility of the user and the non-LPG user, I think it's critical to have a sort of capped margin in a price structure formula that allows the buyer of LPG to ensure he pays the normal price.
Hannah, do you have a comment to this?
Yes. One aspect of our model which helps to address the cost of the cylinder is that because we have local distribution depots and our own employees and technicians are going and putting the cylinder in the customer home and then bringing a refill and exchanging the cylinder and bring it back, it means that far fewer cylinders are needed for the market than I think is typical. It's somewhere less than one and a half cylinders per household is necessary. So that's one thing which is slightly helpful about our model. And the second thing is, of course, on the cylinder financing is if unless there's some cylinder subsidy somewhere, it will have to work its way into the business model as a whole, which means the customer ultimately pays for it in the price of their gas, and that means that it's harder then for gas to compete with the dirty fuels and limits the markets we can be in. So if there were some public facility which were available to help the marketers lower the cost of those things for the marketers, then the consumer could ultimately really benefit from that.
Did Rafaela want to say something? Ask a question?
Yes, indeed. In WFP, we have been always privileging access to energy for our vulnerable beneficiaries compared to the climate aspect. And for example, we have a very successful project in the Rohingya crisis refugee camps, where LPG did represent a very good response, and together with the partners in IOM, FIU, etc., we are providing LPG to refugees. However, LPG is not the solution, as it has been said, for every possible situation. And so we are intensively looking at electricity as another alternative in many cases. And I wanted to ask, since improved biomass stoves have been mentioned as an alternative, but for us, the most promising alternative is actually electricity. I wanted to hear from the colleagues what your thoughts are about that.
That's a very good question, because induction via electricity and the small solar panels actually is an alternative. And Hanna, is this a long-term threat to your model? Can LPG end up being yesterday's fuel if electricity really manages to take off? It's starting to take off in South Asia, Nepal, in India. Are you worried at all, or do you think you can live with this competition?
Well, there are many people from the LPG sector, including our GLPG colleagues and others, who will have very good data on this. But my own view is that of all the things that I'm worried about from a Circle Gas perspective, this is really not one of them.
Okay.
Where clean cooking is really a critical issue in many of the sub-Saharan African countries. And I should say, we're not only interested in those, but just to speak about those first, it will be so long until stable electricity is there as even a potential alternative that I think, unfortunately, in many markets, it's not something which is imminent. I would almost say Kenya is an exception, because the electrification there in the urban areas is increasing very quickly. But in many markets, we see electricity and the rise of LPG very naturally coexisting and growing together. And I'm thinking about many Asian and Latin American countries as well.
Okay. Mari, you raised your hand.
Thank you. I agree with Hanna that the stability and capacity of distribution networks for electricity is a key factor that limits the possibility of electricity for cooking. However, there are solutions that are becoming more and more viable, that are using solar energy supported by batteries that can exist as in an island mode or connected to the electricity grid. And this is happening relatively fast. I think over just the last 2 years, these solutions are becoming more relevant. That said, I would still agree with Hanna that the competition between these solutions is not something we should worry about. As we have seen, the challenge is daunting. It is very large, and there are different types of population, different types of markets. There will be different types of solutions that are suitable for these different segments. The availability of alternatives is also an important factor for consumers to select what they feel is the most correct solution for them. So I would say yes to both.
Sheila, what do you say? Do you feel that electricity is an alternative which is developing for cooking in Ghana?
It is, but it is for a very small elite. Electricity is relatively cheaper than LPG for cooking, only if you're using the induction technology. There are very few estates in Ghana that have the induction technology inbuilt into their kitchens. And so if you look at the statistics, we have quite a few homes that are beginning to use LPG because the technology they're using electricity, because the technology they're using is cheaper, makes it cheaper than LPG. But this is just it's in the minority. And it's also in the elite upper class. The majority of the consumers that you want to drag along are not yet there. Even though electricity access in Ghana is very good, we're over 87% throughout the country. But in terms of accessing the technology that makes electricity cheaper for cooking, it's very, very few people, less than 5% of the population that have access to that. And so we're yet to catch on with that. It's not yet a big deal in Ghana.
Thank you. We are 1 minute over time. I still want to recognize Kimball Chen, who has been trying to ask a question for a long time. And once he's finished, I think we will just call it a day. But Kimball.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Petter?
Yes.
All right. So much of this discussion is concerned business models and the comparative economics of various solutions, including LPG. I want to put that aside and focus on the political question that you raised, Petter. Mari observed at the very beginning of this panel that the amount of resources provided by both the private sector capital markets as well as public sector capital, development banks, development institutions, and so forth, is way short of the amount needed to supply any solution, particularly LPG. Now, the political objection to LPG that you mentioned was fossil fuel, although Dag gave a very good answer. And Dag, I agree with the way you positioned global north being more efficient and leaving room for the global south to use gas in a transition. So I have a question for all of you, especially development governments. Would you feel much more comfortable supporting LPG if the prospect of renewably sourced LPG, i.e. LPG produced from renewable resources, municipal solid waste, agricultural residues, et cetera, were feasible? Because I just called to your attention that the British government supported us to do the first scoping study on this prospect, and we found it was feasible at scale, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa.
It is feasible, and there are lots of possibilities showing up in the OECD countries, but it hasn't been actually tried yet in developing countries. So that's the answer to that. And of course, there are lots of people who will say that and I think some of you actually mentioned it already, that if you build the infrastructure for fossil-based LPG, you can use that for bio LPG as well. But let that be the end. Do any of my panelists, because I want to stay within the hour plus minus 5 minutes, are there any final? Thank you very much, by the way, Chen, for that very interesting and to the point observation. Are there any final comments that want to be made by the 4 panelists before we close? Dag, very quickly, do you think this has brought us forward, this discussion?
I was muted, sorry. Yes, it's very interesting. And I think also the last comment is interesting, that we need to build in the supporting schemes in a way that it lead up to a possible renewable future and not lock in with fossil.
Fine. Sheila, what do you say? Do you have any final comments?
On the last issue, basically, it's possible to look at renewable LPG, but we would have to look at the feasibility, not just feasibility in terms of production on large scale, but the price. Remember, for people in developing countries, price is a big deal. And so if you're producing it and it's cheaper than fossil LPG, I mean, why not? It's easy. It can be easily adopted.
Thank you, Mari.
Yes, maybe just emphasizing the role that the international community can play. I mentioned that financial support and knowledge, policy attention, all these things are required. And the international community and development partners can play a role in all these areas if a decision is made to really put this at the forefront of the SDG7 efforts.
And Hannah, you have the final word.
Maybe it was mentioned earlier in the panel, but to echo what Mari said about putting this at the forefront of SDG7, I just wanted to emphasize the strong gender motivation for working on this as well. And really, it's something which I think has contributed to it being ignored in the past. And I really hope that in the future, this gets a lot more attention than it has to date.
That was a good end of our discussion. Thank you to everybody. It has been on the internet, and it has, and I am sure that it will be discussed further by lots of people. So thank you again on behalf of Norad that you have all taken time and participated in this discussion. So, and thanks to everybody who has made this possible. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Bye.